What's going on, everybody, and welcome back. So clearly, I have a little bit of a different background today. I am not in my office today. I'm actually at I would say, beautiful lake, but it's pretty cloudy outside, a little stormy. But yeah, and that's why my hair is all frazzled and so forth. But we won't talk about that. So I'm actually here to chat with author Robert Redick. We're going to talk a little bit about his brand new release as of today, the 6th of July, Sidewinders, which is book 2 in the Fire Sacrament. But first off, Robert, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's pub day, which means my head is in the clouds. Didn't think this day would ever come, but I'm pretty darn happy. It's going well so far, thanks.
Awesome.
So, how are you?
I'm good. Just a little hot.
Yeah.
Aren't yeah. I mean, I better say, I can imagine you guys. I mentioned earlier, I was talking to Brian Stavely. He's up in Vermont, and he said about how hot it was up there, and I feel like kind of roles have reversed a little bit. It's not quite it's more humid than hot down here, and then you guys are just going through just like an insane heat wave up north. And I can't imagine.
We don't have the developed resistance that I imagine you do, and which frankly I think I had too when I went to the University of Florida. I lived in Gainesville for 6 years off and on, and yeah, I loved it there. Loved it. And I lived in the middle of a cypress swamp with no AC, and it was great. Of course, I was in my early 20s, and no, the old Southern cracker shack architecture kind of makes the best of a bad situation that way, with the open spaces at the roof so that the hot air doesn't get trapped but travels through, and up on stilts, and then all the live oaks gave us lots of deep shade. And at 3 o'clock every day there was a thunderstorm. So
yeah,
out in the cypress swamp, you're basically just wearing a few rags,
right?
Put your feet in a bucket of hot water on the worst days. So back then I didn't mind, and now it's a little harder. But
yeah. I mean, because so I guess what's a normal high up there during the summer?
Oh, who knows what normal is anymore? But I mean, so I've been coming and going in New England now for 24 years. And when I first came up here, I got a job as a stage critic in Maine, and so further north still a little bit. But I distinctly remember going to some outdoor summer theater in the end of June, and we all sat down in our folding chairs to watch the show, and snow flurries started coming down. June, right? And so I was like, I've gone to hell, sort of what I was thinking, because I do not like to be cold.
Right.
So, it's all been changing and for the hotter. But this, every summer breaks records now. It's pretty scary. So.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's just been so weird because, down here, I think we've broken 90, maybe a handful of days where normally like 95 is about normal. With like 60-70% humidity. So it's just like, all right, if you don't have a pool, just jump in the bathtub. I mean, it's always pretty hot, but yeah, it's crazy. I can't, because like I said, Brian was, he was like double fisting an iced coffee and a beer.
Why didn't I think of that before coming on the air? I should have made myself.
You just got ice water.
Yeah, plenty of ice water.
Slacking.
I guess I decided to go for coherence.
There you go.
We'll see how that works out.
So like I always do, I just want to start out, tell me about yourself, tell me about growing up. I mean, clearly you spent some time in Florida, which is pretty close to me up here in Alabama, and just kind of how you got into writing, and then we'll go from there.
I don't know if I should say the screen's freezing up a bit. Is okay. That? Yeah.
It might just be my connection a little bit. I'm sitting on Wi-Fi, so.
Okay. Yeah. Well, what to tell you about me? I kind of have two hometowns, really. I was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, and that's where all the family still is, or a lot of them. It's where my parents are. It's where I went to school. I went to UVA. It's actually a fourth generation UVA, believe it or not. And but then we moved out to Iowa City, Iowa, when I was really young, and we were out there till I was 16. So that also feels like a hometown. It was a wonderful place to be a kid. And then we came back to Charlottesville, and I stayed there into my young adulthood, and did all of high school there and college. And then I went to grad school in international development, and that got me traveling all over the world. That was just an unbelievable privilege. I mean, I can't ever know how much it changed my life, but I started off working and doing research in Argentina, where I went in 92 and 93 for long stays and traveled all over the southern cone of South America, mostly Argentina, but also Chile and a bit in Brazil and Paraguay.
Wow.
Hitchhiking, renting cars, getting in, 27-hour long bus rides, doing just things that, you look back on them. You have memories where it happened, but you have to sort of do an internal double take to really believe that it happened.
Yeah.
There were so many of them from those years. I mean, I went out to a place called Peninsula Valdez that is this sort of a spade-shaped almost island out in the middle of the Atlantic coast of Argentina. It's the size of Connecticut, and back then it had 200 people living on it. And it's all provincial park, so it's protected, but the southern right whales and the elephant seals and the Magellanic penguins and terns and other things, they come in their tens of thousands to reproduce there. Well, the whales in far fewer, smaller numbers, but there are all these natural coves below sea cliffs, and you can walk along the cliffs and look right down on like a family of whales with the calf, being taught to swim and to surface and stuff, and hear them breathing when you're camping at night and stuff. And I was there to it just, and you have to think, was I there? But I really was, and I was writing about park rangers and the training of park rangers for my graduate work. And I hadn't realized it when I sort of dreamed up that plan, but it had the benefit of meaning that, for my job, I had to go to the most incredible corners of the country, all over, from the edges of Patagonia up into the subtropical rainforests. And actually, that's where Peninsula Valdez is where the idea for the Chathran voyage came along, because I was walking along in the mist and along one of those cliffs, and just hearing noises off in the fog, and I just had this idea of how many ships must have wrecked along that coast over the centuries, and brain started churning, and a few years later I was working on the Chathran voyage. So then I married my partner, who I met in graduate school, Massachusetts now, but she works in Colombia, among other places. So we went and lived in Colombia after graduate school. And then she got a job for 2 years in Indonesia more recently. We lived there. So, it's been so good, and most of it has been dumb luck that I, sure, some planning that I, went that way with a kind of parallel career, but
right.
But even so, I know it's so much privilege and so much luck that's let me do that. And slowly it filters into the writing, usually years later, if I've been in a place, some of those rich experiences, I can tell after the fact that they've made their way into the book. So
they kind of just like seep out of your pores, like over time.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like composting, for your garden, you throw all the material in, and then you wait a season or two before it's ready to use. Some people, you hear about writers who like move to Paris and write a brilliant novel set in Paris at the same time. No, that's not going to be me. I'm too busy like walking the streets with my jaw hanging open at first, and then it's only later on, that starts to work out.
Gotta let it season.
Actually, yeah, I always remember I got to hear Umberto Eco give a lecture once in San Francisco, and he was really fierce about this. It's like, all of you out there, and half of you are writers. I know you are. Don't you deny it. You're suffering, aren't you? And he has this great, over the top personality. But then he gets to this point. He says, and you think that you should be writing about what happened to you 2 minutes ago. It doesn't work that way, my friends. Listen to me. When you are in love, you're in love. When somebody hits you in the chin, you say, ah. You don't say, you don't come out with literature. No, that's ah is not literature. Ah is just an ejaculation. It's only later, when you cradle it a while, that you can turn it into art. He's so flamboyant. I was like, okay, I'm never gonna forget this.
Okay, I'm definitely jotting that down, keeping it in the mind cage, as John Glenn would put it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Is that enough about me? Yeah. So
I mean, it's a wonderful backstory. I mean, you know, very well traveled. You've had a lot of amazing experiences. It sounds like. I mean, golly, just, you know, walking around, just listening to all the animals, it's just insane to me. Tell me a little bit about you know, like when you know, what year was it you just like were like, okay, I'm gonna write a novel? Like, you weren't just kind of like, I'm just gonna jot some ideas down because I have this idea. Like, when were you like, I'm gonna take this and like make it into a full novel or series?
you froze for a really long time, by the way.
Oh gosh, I'm sure I did.
Okay. Okay. But let's see. I think I heard the whole question. So when did I first think about it?
Or when did you start like writing it like seriously? Like when did you get the moment you're like, I'm going to turn this into a book?
Well, you know, so when I went to school in Florida, I did get, you know, I got to do this incredible research and I got to do this great training and so on. But it turns out that actual degree program, it taught me a lot about myself in terms of also what I didn't want to do with my career, at least, you know, what's on the front burner for the career, let's say, because my master plan involved, you know, several more decades of working really intensely in international development. But what I realized is that I was getting trained to be like a United Nations bureaucrat or an NGO bureaucrat. And I thought, oh, I can maybe do that and then move up to, you know, a more glamorous version of that. But I realized that the majority of people that I was getting to know who had been through that program or similar programs, like 5 to 10 years later, they were still the bureaucrat. And that's mostly because most of the sort of policy work, it's just in an office, you know, and not only that, but it's in an office writing in NGOEs, which is some of the most deadening boilerplate, unbearable prose you will ever encounter. You know, buzzword upon buzzword upon buzzword, everything committee approved. You know, you can't say anything that might offend a donor, on and on and on. And I realized, my God, I'm signing up for a big chunk of my life just reading and taking seriously this horrible writing, and I can't do that. So this is to say, I shortened the plan and I started moving the international development a little bit to the day job position and ambitions to get serious about fiction earlier. So I finished that degree. I worked in it for a short time, and then I dove right into a novel set in Argentina, actually. By then I was kind of done with Argentina. So that would have been, you know, mid 90s. And I spent 8 years on that Argentina novel, and that is still not published. That's one of those first novel stories.
Right.
Lots of almosts there, and maybe I'll try to go back to it sometime because I still think it's got some potential. But it was a really heavy story, and it was set in the time of the desaparecidos and, you know, the dirty war in the late 70s in Argentina. And I did talk to a lot of people who lost family, who, you know, disappeared and thrown into secret prisons to die and things like that when I was there. So it's very heavy, and I decided, well, you know, while I'm trying to publish that, maybe I'll try something that'll just lift me up a little bit more. Maybe I'll try writing a fantasy. I love fantasy all my life. And, you know, as opposed to not getting published at all, the first fantasy novel got taken instantly, multi-book deal, and, you know, and I've been busy with fantasy ever since. It's not really the plan, you know. It was supposed to be a little detour from my serious literary career, but you know, it's been a blessing. God, I love it so much, and I found you can do so many things. You're free to do things stylistically in fantasy, because I don't think, you know, compared to all the years I spent around literary writers, you know, in big quotes, I think there's not quite so much self-consciousness about what's in style and what's the fad in stylistically.
Mhm.
Now, we in the science fiction and fantasy world, we have our obsessions, some of which never go out of style, like dragons, and some of which may come and go, like steampunk. But stylistically, you can jazz around, you can try things, and everyone says, great, if you wrote a good story, I'm really glad to try it that way. I found more often in the literary world, it's sort of like, oh, they're using omniscience. Don't they know that's out of style now? And it's just, you don't deal with any of that bullshit in science fiction and fantasy, or very,
Right.
very little anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So.
You just may have a couple of readers that like, really?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
So as far as your writing process, how has it changed over the years from your first, this book may never get published, or maybe one day I'll go back to it, to now? Like, do you plot everything out? Do you outline? Do you just jot stuff down and just see where it goes? Are you a gardener or architect?
I plot like crazy. I think the big difference now is that so what happened the very first time I plotted out a novel is what's happened every single time after that. Only the first time it terrified me, and after a destination in mind, and I eventually get to that destination, but the carefully chosen set of turns that I've mapped out, I never stay there. It's kind of like, if you've got a paved road straight to where you're going, and you've also got an off-road vehicle, and maybe inner ear trouble or something like that. So you're off the road and back on it, and off the road and back on it, and you see a lot more interesting things. Maybe that's a terrible metaphor, because those things do awful environmental damage. But you may have like 6 different ways that you could get to your destination, and the back roads may just be more beautiful. And so I often end up on the back roads, or sometimes they turn into shortcuts. Usually they don't, but that's okay, because as long as you get to the destination or some vantage point on that destination, and it's I think what felt like, oh, I can't plan, I can't stick to a plan, and created all that fear. It turned out, as I looked at my process, in hindsight, it was just about staying inspired and excited. Because if it's really a detailed plan, then you're sort of painting, you're filling out a form in a way. You're executing somebody else's thing, because that somebody else is who you were, a month ago when you wrote the plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not as exciting. And when you come to a fork in the road, it's like, wow, over there's this ghoul, and you didn't have a ghoul in this chapter before, and over here it's just, you solve the problem really quickly. Let's go get in trouble with the ghoul. Much more fun.
Yeah. Don't take the path of least resistance.
Yeah, exactly.
Who were, I guess, some of your major influences growing up, and who inspired you to write?
Well, the big predictable answers, of course, like Tolkien, for sure. One I found, it's not quite a writer who's not as well known in this country, although she is really read very much for kids, but she's just such a beautiful writer. Susan Cooper, The Dark is Rising. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she, that series, it is for little kids, but her prose, I'm in my early 50s, and I still read the prose and just stop in my tracks because it's so beautiful. And I think that she decided that there were like 4 or 5 kids in the world who read at a high enough level for her prose, but were still young enough to hang with her little kid story. And then it turned out that there were like 4 or 5 million of them, because she did really quite well. But I've come across very few writers who just said, I'm going to write this like I'm writing for an adult with a degree in English, but I'm writing a young kid's story, and it's gorgeous and it works. So she was a big influence. And then Ursula Le Guin, for sure. Although she is one of those people who seems to take her plan and stick with it. She's she's not a writer who's like me in many senses at all. But someone described her as having a real moral imagination. And I think that sank in at a really early age. It's like, you can't say that she has a sense of humor. I don't think she does. But she's such a brilliant person, brilliant writer, and she creates things of such beauty. Where I could say it in the past tense now because we've lost her, alas, a few years ago. But she was a huge influence. John Crowley, Little Big, was a book that really changed me. And then when I was a little bit older, I started getting into some of the 19th century classics and early 20th century classics. I loved E.M. Forster, Virginia Woolf, and Latin Americans. I had a Garcia Marquez phase, like a lot of writers do. Yeah, I mean, I could go on this subject. I could tie you up all day. But those were some early ones. Then I got into the Russians in a big way, Chekhov and some other short story writers.
So well read is putting it lightly.
Well, I'm obsessed with getting lost in books. That's my safe place, lost inside a fictional world.
Yeah. I feel like that's true of a lot of us.
Yeah. But then I should also say the other big influence, it wasn't a writer, but Dungeons and Dragons. I won't lie or hide it anymore. I'm not ashamed. I used to hide it when I was getting my MFA because they didn't even want to know that you touched fantasy. And if I'd let it be known that I was a role-playing gamer too, I would have been made to stand in the closet or something.
You'd have gotten the evil eye and been told to stay in the corner.
Oh yeah. I actually have a friend. I won't name him, but he's in a very good MFA program, and he told me they basically engineered they had offered him a scholarship and entry to this very good MFA program, and they engineered to cancel his offer when they found out that he was basically writing science fiction.
Interesting.
So foolish. But I'm glad to say that kind of thing happens a lot less than it did a few decades ago. Yeah, so.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit about your books. So I want to just kind of take a trip to the past and talk a little bit about the Chatham voyage. So can you tell us a little bit about the series? What it's about, the books involved, and then we'll kind of go on to your newer stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, so the first series is sort of an adult/young adult crossover, young adult crossover series, and maybe a little bit of that sort of Susan Cooper trying to have more than one audience approach. But it's a big, sprawling, nautical, epic fantasy story across 4 big, thick books. I think that total page count is like 2,200 pages for the 4 books, and it's about empire and race and about a spell that goes wrong and starts making animals erupt spontaneously into human intelligence, and how many of them go mad and some of them have to hide it underground, and so many other things. It's got just plot coming out of its ears. It's 3 continents and 4 empires and multiple intelligent species, and I really had the time of my life writing that series, and that kept me busy for quite a long time. It was my first sale, actually. I had never made a dime off my fiction in any form before. They took the Red Wolf Conspiracy, which is the first one, and it was initially supposed to be a trilogy, but it grew into 4 before I finished it. And I think I absolutely will go back to that series at some point to write at least one more book. It's already there in notes. I don't know if that'll be the very next thing I do after this trilogy is done. But I always wanted to have that kind of, the sort of writer, I guess, or reader I was that was picking up things a bit too old for me. So although I start with teenage protagonists, they grow up really fast across the 4 books. And it doesn't really resemble YA that much by the time it's over. I mean, perhaps to the alarm of some parents who are reading it with their kids, I don't know. But it's, I do have trouble with genre boundaries,
Mm,
as my long-suffering editors will tell you. But it's so it is YA and it is a grown-up story, both. But depending on which end of the story you're talking about, it's more one than the other. So I
right.
finished that, and then I dove into. I wanted to try something that was unambiguously for adults. And this new series, The Fire Sacraments, is very much that. I think that war and the terrible crime of war and the horrific waste that war is was on my mind very much, more than I knew at the time when I started writing it. But I also, I have been thinking about how the genre fantasy and epic fantasy in particular struggles with a couple of things. Struggles with lots of things, as it should. We always try to do better than we've done before, but and we're paying a lot of attention to how we're struggling with gender and race and things like that now, which is terrific. And those are things I struggle with always, trying to challenge myself to do better with each time I launch into a story. But what I was thinking about with the Fire Sacraments was a little different at first, and that was how the genre deals honestly, or perhaps less than honestly, with the trauma of violence, and particularly the psychic trauma and the wounds it leaves behind in the mind. And I wanted to try to do a better job with that than a lot of the epic fantasies I've been reading. So that was part of it. And then I wanted to think a bit about poverty. We have lots and lots of stories in epic fantasy of the humble person who rises to great heights. They're often, and then they got rich and powerful, and those earlier problems were a memory kind of stories. So I guess I found my way to imagining some characters who they're village kids, they're peasants, and they remain so. And they have unbelievable things that happen to them, but they really don't ever lose sight or get revealed to be something other than they are. And that's been really fun. It's been in Master Assassins, I've got show and tell here for you. Master Assassins, the first one, which came out in 2018, the point of view is it sticks with just one of these two brothers. My brothers are Kandri and Mektu, and they're conscripts, village conscripts, caught up in this mad religious war they don't want anything to do with. And they really have very little experience of the world. They've spent their entire lives in a very small, isolated back country area. And you never leave Kandri's point of view in book one. So you really don't know more than he does about the world. And he leaves his home for the first time in Master Assassins and starts realizing how much he doesn't know. And that was a neat challenge for me because, I got to start with the zoom lens really tight on Kandri. And then slowly as he moved through the book, it widens and he begins to figure out, the world isn't quite what I assumed it was. And then when we get to book two in Sidewinders, that the lens just pulls way, way back. And we have like 6 points of view, and they're spread out all over the continent of Urath. And two of them at least are among the most worldly people on the whole continent. And so suddenly it's like, you've been, and also, in Master Assassins, with all the crazy road trip kind of adventures that happen, you go over a pretty small piece of the continent. The total arc of the story is a relatively limited area, and I think it only covers about 28 days and 28 very intense days in the lives of these fellows. But when I was drawing my sketch map for the artist for book two, for the cartographer who turned it into a really nice map, I realized that the whole map for Master Assassins was one little corner of this larger map, and that the brothers literally walk across a desert twice the width of the Sahara in Sidewinders. And then we have these things going on in other parts of the country, of the continent as well. and they're all slowly converging on the same city, where book 3 is focused. But so suddenly this much bigger story is unfolding, and Connery is still playing catch up. He is one of the biggest. He is still the most prominent point of view, and he's trying to make up for a life lived in a little village in the mountains.
So what I'm getting from you is you like these like sprawling epics.
Or at least I can't contain the story to less. I mean, I sit down and tell myself, I'm going to write a short story, and it's going to be short, damn it. If I cut it 20%, I can still call it a novelette,
Right.
It seems to be the way my brain is wired.
You're just gonna start writing. Yeah, like, I gotta add this, and I gotta add this, and that'll be really good in here.
Yeah, it is like that. It's. I remember an early teacher said, you're like the sorcerer's apprentice standing in front of the cauldron, just throwing more things in to see what's going to blow up, and yeah, it's like that. I'm not much of a short story writer anymore, because all my short stories grow.
Oh, your short stories turn into novellas and novels and door stoppers.
Yeah, so I end up with these files full of notes towards future novels, far more than I'll ever write. But so I live in awe of short stories because I love reading them, and I managed to get one written, and Clark's World took it.
I mean, at least you could pat yourself on the back for getting one.
Yeah, one. That's right. Yeah. So
talk a little bit about the nature of genius and the cult of personality in book 2.
Yeah, sure. I guess we were chatting earlier. That's one of those, or two of those themes that I sort of realized after the fact I was thinking about. And sometimes you look back on what you've written and realize, oh, I was meditating on that in a sense all along and didn't realize it. And yeah, precisely so. I mean, I think this trilogy overall is going to be reflecting on what we mean when we talk about genius. And, other than, I think I was trying to make notes about this, we always think it's in someone else, and we never, unless we're like crazy egotists like Donald Trump, we never think it's in ourselves, right? I know quite well I'm not a very stable or any other kind of genius. I'm, just a carpenter who keeps sawing away. But I do think, I was looking back at the stories that have really stayed with me and mattered to me, and often, yes, they have incredible deeds in them. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just the story of the inner relations between a few people. But what makes it moving and shocking and exciting to me, it's always the filter of an exceptional mind. And I realized that and thought, that's what really gets me to sit down in the chair and plug in again. It's like, and it's sort of a banal example in a way, but I'll talk about Frodo for a minute. Because Tolkien doesn't dwell on the interior side of things, he's incredibly brief where that is concerned, so that he can make room for 16 more pages of describing the Runnymede knoll wash or whatever the hell, another piece of landscape. But so he does it with very small brush strokes, so you could almost miss it. But Frodo is the exceptional personality in that story in a lot of ways. He's weak as hell. I mean, he's physically weak. He has no powers per se, but in key moments, he sees what no one else succeeds in seeing. That he has to be the one that stands up in the Council of Elrond and says, "I'll take this, because you great and powerful people have just shown that you can't."
Mm-hmm.
And it's really it's an astonishing thing, but he keeps going. And then in another sense, so does Sam. He's also the one who realizes at a certain point that not only am I doomed to march off to my almost certain death with these wonderful people, bearing this thing that's eating away at my soul. But then later on, he realizes, no, I can't even bring them along. And he has the inner strength to both see that, admit it to himself, and act on it. And that's the wonder, that's the shocking wonder that makes these other things for me, really stay with me. And so, so I call that in a sense, for me, I think genius has come to mean in my reading life, and to some degree my writing life, the person that for whatever reason sees what no one else will either let themselves see or is capable of seeing, or both. And those are the characters that I get really fascinated with. And they're not always sort of heroic, upright people at all. I mean, the character that turned out to be the most popular in Master Assassins and Sidewinders is the other brother, Mektu. I mean, the one I was telling you about, whose point of view I write from, is Kandri, and he's very straight-laced. He's very, you want Kandri at your side if you're in trouble. He's a good man in a tight corner, etc. And his brother is just a train wreck. He's just a hopeless individual. He ought to be dead by 24. His brother and his uncle and everyone who actually cares for him, they want to smack him 5 times a day. He's one of those people who perceives what the absolute worst thing to say in a situation is, and compulsively has to say it just because he can't not, because it gets too tense if he doesn't. So that made him so much fun to write. And he's a child in a 24-year-old's body too. He confesses, I think it was something that ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak. But in a version of Master Assassins, I have him rambling on as he does, and he confesses that he wants to be an actor. Now remember, he's like in picture the deepest corner of the Ozark Hills. There's nothing there for him to base an acting career ambition on at all, and he can't go anywhere else because he'd have to travel like 10,000 miles. And so that they look at him like he has 2 heads.
Right.
But he's a terrible fish out of water. And so that there was my first beginning glimpse that he's not just an asshole, he's also gifted. Right. I had editors saying, please don't write him this way, tone him down, or cut him out of your novel. He's such a crazy pig, nobody's going to want to read him, And I'm glad that in this occasion I stuck to my guns, because he's a real jerk sometimes. Right. And he's the one who sometimes sees what nobody else can see, and manages to save the day in different ways. So that's a long answer to the nature of genius question. And then, I won't say much about the other side of it. I am also, it turns out I'm writing about cult of personality a lot. And, like I said, things process for years before they work their way in. But so I don't think it was Trump directly, honestly, because I think it was something that, I'd written most of Master Assassins before Trump came on the scene. But I'd been thinking about how individuals who are very good at lying, both to themselves and others, have such an oversized effect on this world. And so, I wrote about, one person I was thinking of actually is Robert Mugabe, who, like, in a small way, like the prophet in this trilogy, began as a true liberation hero and, became something much more problematic in the life of his people. In the case of the Fire Sacraments trilogy, the prophet becomes something far, 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 far more problematic. She goes deeply insane and decides that she is a messiah, and that her 11 sons are destined to become the 11 kings of the continent, and that everyone else must kneel. But it was a really fun character to write, and I realized that if this was going to work, she had to be someone who had basically convinced all 1 million+ members of her people, of her ethnic group, that since she liberated them from centuries of bondage and slavery, that she really was a messiah, which was not, if you were going to choose anyone to be a messiah, that would be the person you'd choose, somebody who'd done that for you. But she systematically, in a way that would make North Korea, envious, built a cult around herself. Yeah. And I'm still unwinding just what that is going to mean for the whole continent. But it's going to mean war, and wars has come already. So
I gotcha. So you've already touched on one of these. So we'll go to the next one. And you mentioned this before our chat. Did the current pandemic have any impact on your writing? I mean, I know Master Assassins clearly came out well before last year. Once the pandemic even was talked about. But I mean, did it affect you at all writing Sidewinders? And do you know if it's going to have any effect on the third novel in the series?
Well, the first thing you did was freak me out. I mean, in addition to like the freak out that we were all living through, right? The actual effects of the pandemic, just in the little trivial window of my writing life, it freaked me out a lot because I thought people, I had a panic attack that people are going to think, oh, he's just exploiting the situation in a crass kind of way. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to have to put disclaimers in the front of my book that, oh, please believe me. And I'd already planned it before it happened. And, and go look at the publication date of book 1, This
isn't the first book.
Yeah, right. But then I chilled out and I realized, I just tell the truth. It's just weirdly echoing reality. I mean, literally the way people die of my imagined plague is, the plague is called the throat rust, and their throats develop deposits that tighten and tighten and tighten around their windpipe until they can't breathe. So, that with people dying in ventilators, I thought, shit, this is just too close to home.
Yeah.
But there's a big difference in the sense that, so the setup in this series, everything takes place on one continent, the continent of Urath. And the curious thing, as far as the plague is concerned, is that Urathis are mostly immune and always have been. It only kills about 1 in 10,000 Urathis, and I think that's the number. Whereas in the rest of the world, all the other continents, it kills like 1 in 8. And consequently, or at least this is what the Urathis are told, a quarantine has been forced on Urath because the rest of the world is just damned afraid that if it gets out, they'll just die and die and die and die. And it does get out still in ways that are, part of the mystery we get to explore. But so for 300 years, the people of Urath have been held in this really, really rigid quarantine. And you can tell that technologically and in other ways, economically, things have advanced and gone on everywhere else on the planet more than in Urath. So this just sneaks in tiny little accidents and details and leaks of information, because really Urath doesn't know much about what's going on in the outer world. But we begin to find out that this story of why they're locked in quarantine is not as simple as that. And, without giving a big spoiler, there is real money to be made in being the ones who get to decide who lives and who dies in the world. So all of that will be revealed. But so, it isn't, so it's not like there's not every 10 pages somebody isn't dying of the plague, because it's all the death is happening on other continents for the most part. So it's this specter right through the novel, and yet it isn't a day-to-day reality for the people, except that they're under this quarantine.
Right. What was your, I guess, true inspiration for this series?
I mean, it was kind of like what I was talking about. I always have a character before anything else. That just seems to be the way my brain works. That I realize that I'm imagining a person or a few people, and maybe the beginnings of a circumstance that they're in. But yeah, I think I imagine someone in trouble, and just what the nature of the trouble is very hazy at first. And in that case, this was Kandri and Mektu. I knew I wanted to write a story about siblings, and then, so I had this sort of a feeling of tension and danger and, really tough situation, and a sort of a mirror between, the outer situation and the crisis of their relations, because they have the most intense of love-hate relationships. I mean, Kandri is always reflecting on the high likelihood that Mektu's idiocy and irresponsibility is likely to get both of them killed. And he's fighting this temptation he's ashamed of, to just walk away. He has this dialogue, and some people can't be saved. Some people, sometimes you have to cut bait. And of course he thinks that, and he hates himself because Mektu has no one else. And then he says, but if I don't, I'm going to die along with Mektu. We're living in a dictatorship where the one thing you can't do is talk back. Mektu always talks back. He can't not. He just can't. He just can't not. There's literally a scene in Sidewinders where somebody has got a knife to his throat, and the guy with the knife is begging him to shut the fuck up. Not because he's got any power in the situation, not like there's some third party that's going to hear them, just because I can't stand it. I don't want to kill you. Just shut up. And he can't, so where was I going with this? So yeah, the brothers, that was the inspiration. So they have a really bad outer situation and a really bad inner situation. And so when I knew I had that sort of a feeling, I just sat back and thought, what tangible circumstances might lead to this sort of instinctive feeling for a situation that I have. And then I started building the world around them. And like I said, I was thinking about war, and I was thinking about poverty. And so all of that, I guess, was swirling around. The story, it kind of grew outward in layers. And the first layer was this prison-like army camp. I mean, it very much is a prison. You go there, you serve the prophet, and the sin is talking back, but also, the unpardonable sin is not believing. So running away means to no longer believe in the holy war. But they don't believe. And, they have lost their faith. Very early in Master Assassins, we realize they realize they've lost their faith. And then suddenly life is unbearable, and they must go. So.
Well, can you hold up the books one more time? Let everybody
bet.
see your beautiful covers.
So this one came out today. This is book 2, Sidewinders. But I should say, people are telling me it works as a standalone too, and that was my hope, that you could read it as a standalone if you wanted to. However, it very much is part 2, and this is part 1, Master Assassins.
And Master Assassins is a phenomenal novel. That was one of my top reads in 2018, so I highly recommend it. Yeah, you can thank Mark Lawrence, because he was like, read this book, and I was like, okay, we'll do it. Whenever Sir Lawrence tells me to do something, I do it.
I really need to have like a little icon with Mark Lawrence there, but no, I mean, just today too. He's in UK time. Before I even woke up, he had said Happy Publication Day and sent out copies of his Goodread reviews. He has single-handedly done so much for me, and I'm really deeply grateful.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So yes, everybody, you can buy copies of both books today. It's out and readily available. I know the audio for Sidewinders comes out in, I believe it's September
8th.
From Tantor Audio. So if you enjoy audiobooks, you can go ahead and go pick up Master Assassins, and then pick up Sidewinders in September. You can also pick up Robert's first series, The Chatham Voyage, which is a $4 series. It's widely available everywhere, and I highly recommend doing that. But Robert, thank you so much. Congratulations on Pub Day today. And we'll do this again soon, because I don't want to wait another 6 months after a virtual convention to chat with you.
Thank you so much. I loved TBRCon, by the way, and I love this chat. So I really appreciate it, and keep doing the great work you do, David.
Thank you so much, Robert. We'll talk again soon.
All right. Take care now.
See ya.